Order, order. Paul Scully to move the motion.
Thank you, Mr Walker. I beg to move that this House has considered e-petition 209433 relating to a referendum on the abolition of the House of Lords. I would like to, first of all, say how much it is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Mr Walker. And as I tend to do, I'd like to just quickly read the petition into the official report. The petition in its fullness reads, to give the electorate a referendum on the abolition of the House of Lords. The House of Lords is a place of patronage where unelected and unaccountable individuals hold a disproportionate amount of influence and power which can be used to frustrate the elected representatives of the people. As of a couple of hours ago, there were 169,215 people that signed that petition. It's an apt moment to be debating this as well, because at the moment the House of Lords are up in the other end with an incredible amount of influence and power on the EU withdrawal bill as they carrying on the debating of the amendments that have been rejected by this place. And we'll see what comes back to us a little bit later on. I'd just like to congratulate the petitioner, Rob McBride, who's in the gallery today with his wife. And I had a snatched conversation with him. I hope to catch up with him afterwards. But really what motivated him to start the petition, and it was very much of a pure argument before the EU withdrawal bill came to that place, talking about the fact in this day and age, he believes that there's no place for appointed members of a legislative body. And I'll hopefully talk about the options and discussions that we've had, that the Lords have had themselves, and I've had with a number of university and school students when we've been talking about the issues and the practicalities around Lords reform. But obviously, I suspect that a lot of the 169,000 people that have followed Rob's lead in this petition have been specifically motivated because those signatures did come really, really quickly following the Lords' consideration of the EU withdrawal bill. And I suspect a lot of people were concerned, were really concerned about how the Lords had started to step, in my view as well, over its remit. So there are a lot of things. Why did they do that? It's because I believe that some of the amendments that they've actually brought back to this place were not amendments that were in the scope of the original bill. Talking about the EEA, talking about the customs union, there are other places for consideration of those things, not least the trade and customs bill that's coming before us again in a few weeks' time. There are things, though, things like the consideration of the Henry VIII, so-called Henry VIII clauses, that are well within the Lords' remit to be considering and voting on in their place. It may be uncomfortable for the government. It may be uncomfortable for some members like myself who voted to leave the EU that really wants to get on with it now. But nonetheless, the Lords does not exist for my comfort or the government's comfort. It actually exists to scrutinise legislation and bring it back, hopefully, in a better place than when they found it. But when I talk about my concerns about the fact that the Lords has overstepped its mark in throwing back some of the amendments that it has, is evidenced also when you look at some of the comments. So Lord Billamoria said when he was considering new clause 49 that it's Parliament, thanks to this amendment, that will have the ability to stop the train crash that is Brexit. Well, it's just not appropriate for the upper house to be thwarting the will of the people, to be coming back and getting us to consider wrecking amendments effectively on a bill that was clearly within our manifesto and a bill that we need to get passed in timely fashion if we're going to leave the EU in an orderly way. Indeed, Baroness Jones, when she was considering her position in the chamber there, said she was going to vote for one of the amendments, but the speeches in favour of it actually turned her against it. She said there's clearly more of an agenda than just allowing more oversight of the process. And it is oversight of the process that the Lords is there to deal with. They do many, many different things, but within the chamber itself, about 40% of the work of the House of Lords is actually in scrutiny. So it's debating, it's asking questions, it's making, responding to ministerial statements and these kind of things. And then the rest of their time, the 60% of their time, is improving draft legislation, including the primary legislation, but also SIs. And frankly, just speaking to a number of the members of the House of Lords, they do take a lot of time, a lot of interest in dealing with statutory instruments, probably more so than here, because typically we may rely on a government majority to get some SIs through. They really do take their role of scrutiny and adding their expert view very, very seriously indeed. I will give way.
The honourable gentleman not agree with me that regardless of the legislation being considered, and in a country that considers itself, I would hope, a democracy, it is an affront to democracy when we have over 800 unelected peers considering legislation and at the same time, and 13 new appointments recently, and at the same time we face the prospect of the democratic chamber being further reduced.
I thank the Honourable Lady for that intervention, and I will talk about the numbers and the need to reduce numbers, in my view, a little bit later on. I'll also talk about the practicalities of whether we have an elected or appointed, and whether, if it is appointed, if that's how that gets reformed, and the need for a chamber in the first place. Do we go unicameral like they have in New Zealand? Is there scope for doing that? But one of the great things...
Just on that point, of course, in Scotland and Wales, we have unicameral chambers, and whilst we may have issues with the Assembly or the Scottish Parliament or not, it all seems to work perfectly well.
I thank the honourable friend for that intervention. I would say, though, whereas they can work perfectly well with the unicameral system, I have no doubt that we would survive quite happily. There is something that the House of Lords can, and often, not always, does offer, and that's really within its composition. Because one of the advantages of having an appointed system is that you can bring in experts that can add something that expertise that we don't necessarily have in this place. Give you some examples in the world of science. You've got the brain pioneer Baroness Greenfield. You've got the Lord Winston, fertility expert. You've got Lord Darcy. You've got business. You've got Lord Green of Hurstpierpoint, who used to be the chief executive of HSBC. Lord Rose from Marks and Spencer's. Lord Sugar. Social policy changes like Baroness Newlife, Baroness Lawrence, and Lord Bird, of course, the creator of The Big Issue. And you've got culture, Lord Bragg, Lord Hall, who used to be the head of BBC, both the Lord Palumbos. One was chairman of the Arts Council, the other younger Lord Palumbo was the founder of the Ministry of Sound. Sporting people like Baroness Gray Thompson, and people from public services like Lord Danner, adding that military expertise, and Lord Hogan Howe, the former Met Commissioner of the Police Service here in London. And you've got other people from security services, philanthropy, human rights campaigners, religious leaders, beyond the obvious statutory role of the bishops, legal experts and academics, and, of course, former members of this place, which actually those people, maybe we can cover in a second in a bit more detail, but do at least have an understanding of the parliamentary process so that can help business get through. I'll happily give way.
The honourable member for giving way. On that point, he's making an argument that there are many members of the House of Lords who have considerable expertise in certain areas of policy, and that benefits the apparatus of government. But surely, of course, these people could be drawn to advise the government in many other ways, by the setting up of expert panels, by just simply having advisers to the government. They don't have to be part of the legislature in order for government to benefit from that advice.
I thank the honourable gentleman for that intervention, and it's an interesting point. I think, but actually, if you have an existing situation, I think basically what's effectively happened is that we had a situation that nobody would have created, the hereditary peers that we originally had in the House of Lords right up into the 90s. And that first level of reform went through under Tony Blair. But then there was nothing really put in its place to replace it. And I think that's where we are in this halfway house at the moment. Happily give way.
I would not want them to inadvertently mislead the House, and perhaps we could put on the record that there are still 92 hereditary peers in this place.
Forgive me, you're absolutely right. And again, I will cover that later on in my speech. But when it was solely hereditary peers, no, thank you very much for allowing me to correct the record in that. There's clearly more that the House of Lords needs to do, however it is composed, in terms of being representative of the country, not just leave the public opinion in terms of political opinion for reflecting the general election, but also in terms of more women, more people from ethnic backgrounds. It's interesting, however, to note that both the leaders of the two main parties in the Lords are female. All three of the main three leaders are actually younger than their counterparts in this place here. And funnily enough, they're doing their little bit for gender equality by having elected their first male speaker, Lord Fowler. So they have a good record of supporting women in the most senior positions at the moment. But clearly, there's more that they can do. But it's not just all about legislation in the Chamber. It's actually about committee work they do. They form their select committees in a different way than we do here, where we tend to reflect a government department. They have more cross-cutting committees, not least things like the Science and Technology Committee, which really does make the most of the expertise that they have. Essentially, the House of Lords does more things than the House of Commons does less of, frankly, either by dint of time, by political imperative that we have, and the different priorities maybe that drive us in different ways. But I come back to the fact that they should not go beyond the remit, which it did clearly within the EU withdrawal bill. There's obviously a lot of different changes, checks that have happened over the last 100 years. So we have the Parliament Acts in 1911 and 1949, which really meant that it couldn't block legislation, it couldn't block money resolutions. They can hold up bills for up to a year, but then we would be able to, as a government, reintroduce bills and not seek the House of Lords' consent at the beginning of the next parliamentary session. So some tension is no bad thing, but it has to have its limits. And I think, as I say, it has been overstepped in this instance. The Salisbury Convention would normally kick in for something like the EU withdrawal bill, because that was clearly in our 2017 manifesto, as was our specific pledge to leave the customs union and the single market. However, that's all very well, but that only stops coming in within this parliamentary session. There's obviously a timescale issue with the EU withdrawal bill, because we're going to be leaving at the end of March next year. So we've got to get this in plenty of time to make sure that we leave the EU in an orderly way. And if this bill is either held up too long, or it's changed beyond recognition, then that's really going to affect our negotiating position now, but it's also going to affect our how orderly we can leave the EU come next March. So that's important. I'll happily give one.
Would you accept to some extent, we're in this rather strange period of a 2-year session of Parliament, which is quite unusual. If we'd actually stuck to the normal protocol of a 1-year Parliament, then the Parliament Act could have applied in this instance, and this blockage could have been removed in time for us to have actually left the EU in March of next year in the normal circumstances. So actually the government is at fault for having this extended session, which has actually rendered the Parliament Act rather difficult to deploy in these circumstances.
Honourable friend, for that intervention, and we are under obviously unusual circumstances in all manner of things. Brexit being unusual, the two-year session being incredibly unusual as well. So this is why I think I've talked a lot already about the fact that the Lords, in my view, have overstepped their remit. However, what we need to do for those people, and again, the petitioner really isn't talking about the EU withdrawal bill, so I'll just try and park this after this point, that we are in a situation where we need to look at that bill in the whole, because it may be thwarting the government now, but it depends how this process actually finishes when it comes back to us after the consideration of the amendments on Wednesday and the third reading and these sort of things. If we can get it within within the form of the bill was intended to be in, even if it has been amended, which is exactly what the Lords are there to do. But as long as it's not been amended with beyond recognition and beyond the remit of the original bill, then actually, yes, it's created a lot of tension, but we still got there in the end. And a lot of things that we do in this place may look odd to people, may look arcane to people, but it tends to have a way of working. And some of this is done not just in the chamber, but also through the usual channels and through debate and discussion outside the chamber as well. I talked a little bit about the fact that the reforms have really only been half completed, and it's been mentioned about having the possibility of an elected chamber already. This is one of the options. So do we abolish? Do we go elected? Do we have a hybrid system when we mix half some elected, some appointed, or do we not? Or do we just keep the same at all? I don't think anybody's saying that we should keep the same, exactly the same. But one of the issues with the elected House of Lords is that we went through this process before my time in this place, and nobody could agree on the detail. So whereas there was a lot of sympathy for an elected element, at least, of the House of Lords, no one could say which percentage, how long the terms were going to be, and these kind of things. So that's one of the reasons it didn't go through, and it then is going to take a lot of parliamentary time, which I'd be interested to see what the Minister has to say. If that was to come back to us, what could we agree on? What could we coalesce around? I'd happily give way.
Thank the honourable member for giving way. On this point, he's been describing various reforms to the House of Lords over the years, and I think he would agree with me that the process has somewhat stalled in recent years. But all of those reforms have been motivated by people who wished to see the Lords become more accountable, who were concerned that people were in a position of making laws over citizens without being accountable. Does he agree with me that it's rather ironic that the citizens have to petition the House of Commons asking for reform, that the government does nothing to reform and will not make time available, and yet the House of Lords themselves are arguing for reform because their crisis of legitimacy has become so acute?
Gentleman, for that intervention, but I think this comes to the nub of the problem, because it's what kind of reform do you want to does one want to achieve? We talked a lot in the last Parliament, or members that were here did then, or the coalition government Parliament, should I say? And then they were talking about elections. They just could not sort out and agree on one simple solution. The Lords has indeed started talking about its own reform, which I'll cover in a second. One of the honourable gentleman talked about hereditaries, and this is the daft thing with the 92 that are left. Again, it's a halfway house. We had the ridiculous situation, and you can understand why people are concerned, and people do look on the House of Lords and either want to change it or question its legitimacy. When you had the situation in 2016, when we have a by-election for one of the members of the House of Lords, it happened to be a Lib Dem peer that died, Lord Avebury. And at that time, they had 7 candidates put up for election, hereditaries from around the country. But the electorate was only 3. I mean, how daft is that when you've got an electorate that's far smaller, half the size of the field of candidates? And that does make a mockery of the entire process. So clearly, we do need to look at the situation. The government's already gone some way towards trying to lay a path for change. So the House of Lords Reform Act in 2014 allowed members for the first time to retire or resign themselves permanently, and those who don't attend or convicted of a serious offence that carries a prison sentence of a year or more, they can cease to be members. Now, that wasn't the case before. Again, that's something that is a bit daft, which I'm glad was sorted out. And then the House of Lords Expulsion and Suspension Act in 2015 enabled a suspension to be imposed on a member that would run beyond the end of the Parliament, and it would allow the House of Lords to expel members as well. Now, as part of this process, what we did is we went to speak to, the University of Strathclyde politics students came here, and we discussed the issue with them. We also had, just this morning, Stenning Grammar School come to do a tour of this place, and as we followed up, they came to the education centre, the fantastic resource that we have there. And as part of that process, instead of just a Q&A with a member, we actually sat down and really started to look at the options for reform, including abolition. What I was interested with both is that they both actually they did actually unanimously agree, both sets of students, that we shouldn't abolish, we shouldn't elect, but we should actually carry on with appointed, but with significant change. So they looked on the House of Lords and say, well, why would people be motivated to sign a petition like this? It's because they felt there was a lack of understanding. It sounded old-fashioned and democratic, lacked visibility, not diverse and reflective of society at all. They couldn't relate to it, and it seemed to be comprised a lot of politicians for life, effectively people moving from one end of the building to the other, and hereditary peers were raised as a concern. But they didn't believe that, that it's, the fact that it's an important institution that does more scrutiny with lots of expertise, with peers expert in their field with nothing to lose. So they didn't believe it should be abolished. How should it be reformed? Well, the Strathclyde students said they should remove the bishops. They looked about whether they should remove political affiliation. Should we go just totally crossbench? But then they couldn't agree on how. It comes back to that idea about how you reform the House of Lords. And they wanted stronger emphasis on post-legislative scrutiny, with committees looking at laws a year later or so they can actually look back and see if they're working or not. And similarly, the Stenning Grammar School people, there was one person, actually, one student that didn't believe that we should reduce the numbers, and came up with a really interesting point, basically saying how the larger size allows for more diversity in opinions. Clearly, we talked about the fact that there's not enough diversity in that place at the moment, but it can have scope. So that because not everybody turns up for every debate, you still have plenty of opportunities for BME members, women members, depending on the subject matter that they're talking about. You're drawing from a bigger pool. So that was an interesting point that she raised. But it comes back to the what reforms are possible, what reforms the Lords themselves are looking at, the Burns Committee, the Lord Speaker's Committee on the size of the House. And they've come up with some interesting ideas. They believe themselves that the House is too big. When you're talking about 800, it's one of the biggest legislative bodies in the world. But they recommend that it should be reduced to 600 members and capped at 600 members. That will actually obviously bring it in line with this place should the boundary reviews go through later on in the year. And they would link its composition to the general election results. They'd reduce it to 600 in basically just over a decade through a natural system of an accelerated 2-out, 1-in programme. And the new members would be appointed on a 15-year term. No party would be allowed a absolute political majority, and a minimum of 20% of seats would be reserved for independent crossbench members, largely appointed by the House of Lords Appointment Commission. Again, the students that I was speaking to all felt that the patronage should be reduced, if not removed, and then therefore an independent commission should have a far greater say in the membership of that place. Political appointments should be shared between the parties, so if there are some political appointments, the Burns Committee believe that should be in line with the result of the previous general election, defined as an average of the party's share of the national vote and the seats won in this place. The formula and the 15-year term combined would therefore ensure that the House of Lords reflected the country over the medium term. Now, that in itself, I think, if you can get consensus within the House of Lords, hopefully will start to bring the place, although it won't be enough for some who have been arguing about election, the petitioner who's clearly been arguing for abolition, it will at least bring that place into some semblance of order that people can start to relate to, that can start to use the expertise that they undoubtedly have and concentrated on the things they need to be doing, but whereas we've got to understand the concern that the Lords must, therefore, quid pro quo, stay within the remit that it has. But we should never lose sight of the fact that what ultimately matters is the contribution peers do and make to scrutinising and improving legislation and the difference that they can make when doing this. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered e-petition 29433 relating to a referendum on the abolition of the House of Lords. I call Mr Justin Madders.
Under your chairmanship. Many members will be familiar with the Dunny-on-the-Wold by-election when the winning candidate, an S. Baldrick of the Adder Party, stood to represent a constituency whose population consisted of 3 rather mangy cows, a dachshund named Colin and a small hen in its late 40s. The candidate went on to surprise everyone by achieving a majority of 16,472. I'm, of course, referring to a plot from an episode of Blackadder III. All very amusing, but that scenario is only slightly less absurd than the one that we've already referred to in the opening comments from the Honourable Member, which took place on the 19th of April 2016, which was the election of Viscount Thurso of Ulster. He was one of 7 candidates in an electorate of 3. I'm pleased to report on that occasion at least the turnout was 100%. And it gets worse, because despite being elected by just 3 people, Viscount Verso actually boasts one of the largest democratic mandates of the 780 members of the other place. If this was a plot of a comedy series, we would laugh. If this was a situation in another country, our media would sneer. But this is what apparently passes for democracy in the United Kingdom in the 21st century. And this is a situation that, yes, successive governments have chosen to allow. The response of the current government to the petition we are debating today shows that things are unlikely to change at the moment. They have said, whilst comprehensive reform is not a priority, the government will continue to work to ensure that the House of Lords remains relevant and effective by addressing issues such as its size. I would argue that it would be extremely difficult for the House of Lords to be relevant as long as it remains unelected. The fact that 169,000 people have signed the petition that we are debating today shows that we cannot continue to kick this down the road into the long grass. This historical aberration has to change. We are told that despite the lack of democratic accountability, the Lords at least do a good job, although I think there are mixed views on the government benches about that at the moment. And indeed, Mr Walker, it's true of some. I've worked closely with many members of the other place and have been extremely impressed by their contribution. But I see no reason why, with such ability, they would not have a good chance of being able to continue to serve in public life if they subjected themselves to the will of the people. However, sadly, there are also some within the other chamber who are much less assiduous. In an age where the electorate is often criticised for its apathy, I was astonished to find that the record turnout for a vote in the House of Lords in recent times was actually only 3% higher than the vote at the last general election. Even at its absolute best, 1 in 5 members of the other place do not cast a vote. And of course, the exception that I was referring to there is very much out of the ordinary. We know that on average, only between half and 2/3 of the members of the upper house actually attend, and there are many members who have not spoken or voted in a considerable amount of time. That they can do so without any apparent accountability is an affront to democracy and an insult to the public.
Intervene, I take his point, but does he recall when all of this crashed and burned in the coalition government? It crashed and burned because of the suggestion, almost insistence of an elected element, and it was all about the primacy of the House of Commons. Actually, what was going on was reform of the House of Commons, because the moment it was argued that anybody in the House of Lords became elected, they had just as much legitimacy as those of us in the Commons, and therefore the blockages and the delays that we're experiencing now would only get more profound and would have some justification, and that's why it failed.
I appreciate that, but it doesn't make the system any more acceptable to me in the current circumstances. And I think the problem that successive governments have found with this, and the trap that they in fact we've all fallen into, is that we obsess about how we're going to make the system work, rather than actually saying as a statement of principle that we don't believe that an unelected chamber in this country is an acceptable way to proceed. And I think we should stay as a starting point that we want abolition, and then if we agree that, we should have a period of time to actually work out what it is that we want instead.
Thank you. I agree very much with the honourable gentleman talking about the credibility gap, about people cogitating and reflecting on legislation when they have no democratic accountability. Would the honourable gentleman agree with me that that credibility is further undermined by the fact that members of the House of Lords pay no tax on their House of Lords earnings or allowance?
Thank the honourable member for that intervention. I wasn't aware of that. I think there has been issues in the past about people involved in political parties, be it through donations or through other involvement and paying tax. I think it's absolutely right, if you're a resident in this country, if you're taking part in the democratic process, that you are subject to the same rules as every other citizen. So we're told that expertise and knowledge is in such abundance amongst members of the other place that radical reform would pose a risk to the ability of Parliament to scrutinise legislation. But the truth is, out of the 30 most recent nominations, 7 were formerly members of Parliament, 1 was the former General Secretary of the Labour Party, and 1 was the former Deputy Chairman of the Conservative Party. Indeed, since the Life Peerages Act of 1958, a third of the 1,452 peers created have been former MPs who were relieved of the bothersome inconvenience of having to obtain the consent of the electorate before being allowed to continue in public life, while many more nominees were councillors, party donors or staff. Of the members appointed since May 2010, half are either former MPs or former local councillors, and a further fifth are former special advisors or party employees. So it appears that there's actually very little difference between the qualifications and the types of people in both houses. And in response to the argument about expertise, I would simply ask, what is it about earning the legitimacy of the popular vote that precludes a person from having expertise on a particular subject? The House of Commons has plenty of experts in all walks of life, and the fact that they have to face elections doesn't seem to prevent them from coming here in the first place. Yes, certainly.
And actually I agree with him on that point, because I think of my colleague Dr Philippa Whitford, the Honourable Lady, the member for Central Ayrshire, who was a breast surgeon for 33 years, makes an enormous contribution in the House of Commons at health questions and through health legislation. But she still had to go to the electorate on both 2 occasions for the people of Central Ayrshire. So I would absolutely back up his point that yes, we can have people in here with various professional backgrounds, but there's no reason why they can't be subject to the election just like the rest of us.
I thank the honourable member for his intervention. Indeed, I share a brief with that particular honourable member, and I think all sides of the House recognise and value the expertise that she has. Indeed, there are a number of continuing to perform medical professionals in the House, and they have up-to-date relevant experience, which I think is really important. And, of course, I'm not claiming there are no valuable elements of the current House of Lords. There are many talented members who demonstrate very high levels of integrity, expertise and independence. However, we make a mistake if we assume that these characteristics are naturally imbued into the upper chamber because of the way the members are appointed. And that argument will always fail if we just watch every opportunity for their indolence, as opposed to every time they're making a decision that we don't agree with. I would say that appointment does not guarantee effective independence and expertise any more than an election would actually preclude those qualities. And crucially, all of the positive qualities of the other place are fatally, in my mind, compromised by the lack of democratic accountability. So we are essentially saying to the public, we trust you to decide on our future relationship with Europe. We trust you to elect MPs, to elect councillors, to elect police and crime commissioners and mayors, but we just don't think you're up to the job of electing an upper house. And we've heard a lot about how the Lord's actions during the EU withdrawal bill has possibly changed some members' opinions about the way the other place operates. I personally don't have any particular truck with that, just as I have no truck with people who have become converts to the House of Lords because of the way they have operated in recent times. Just because the Lords may vote in a particular way on a particular occasion, might suit your political view, does not, in my mind, negate the overall democratic deficit that its continued existence in its current form represents. Let's not allow the day-to-day decisions and the painfully slow incremental reform to cloud the big picture. The House of Lords belongs to a bygone era of privileged establishment and a closed political world when we are, in fact, becoming a much more open society. The time has come to end this relic of an earlier age and bring our democracy into the 21st century.
David T.C. Davis.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Mr. Walker. During the early part of the 19th century, the power in this country began to shift away from those whose right to make legislation was something that they inherited through an accident of birth and who generally sat in the House of Lords, and instead it began slowly and imperfectly to go towards those who had actually won the support of the public in some way and who were therefore more likely, although not necessarily, I'm afraid, to have gained their position through ability and hard work. And they, of course, sat in the House of Commons. And at that time, as we both know, the old Tory party started to disappear. Historians say that the last Tory Prime Minister was the Duke of Wellington. And those old Tories began to be replaced. I'm going to come back to his successor in a minute. But those old Tories were replaced by people like Peel and Disraeli. So it is sad, actually, that one of Wellington's descendants is amongst those who now seem to be forgetting the lessons of history and the importance of the Parliament Act in our Constitution, and who are hell-bent on overturning the result of the referendum and the 2017 general election. The 2017 election in which 90% of the public voted for the two major political parties who are standing on an explicit manifesto of withdrawing Britain from the European Union. Now, not only are the House of Lords unelected, they're an unelected body that still contains, as we heard, nearly 100 people who are still sitting there interfering in the legislation of this country simply because of an accident of birth, which I think is absolutely outrageous. They're also, as we know, unanswerable to the people, and they're unrepresentative. We heard earlier on about the fact that there's not enough representation of women or ethnic minorities in the House of Lords. There's not enough representation of people with different political views in the House of Lords. How can we explain the fact, and how can we defend the fact as Democrats, that nobody from UKIP has ever been appointed to the Lords, despite the fact that millions of people have voted for them in successive elections for the European Parliament and in general elections? And even at the last election, where the two major political parties took UKIP's major policy of pulling out of the EU, they still got nearly 2% of the vote. But whereabouts are the members of the House of Lords? I, of course, have never voted UKIP. I would never advise anyone to do so. But I am a Democrat, and I recognise the rights. Yes, I recognise the rights of the millions of people who have supported that political party and who've earned the right to be there. And I find it absolutely ridiculous that the Duke of Wellington is able to interfere in legislation affecting this country, but Nigel Farage, as the leader of a major political party that has had a major impact on this country, is not invited to sit in the House of Lords. He, in my opinion, has got a far greater moral right to be there than the Duke of Wellington. But of course, as I said earlier on, I didn't join the Tory party of the Wellingtons. I joined the party of Peel and Disraeli, and later Churchill and Mrs Thatcher. And what I see when I look at history is that something united all of these people over the centuries. And one of those things, of course, was a belief in free trade. That's what brought Peel to get rid of the Corn Laws in the 1830s. And it's why Winston Churchill, before he became known for saving us from the blight of fascism, was actually best known in the early part of the 20th century for his sterling defence of free trade and his opposition to locking Britain into a sort of a trading arrangement with countries with which we were said to have some sort of historical relationship. And what all of these people also embodied was a belief that people should get to where they get to on merit and on achievement and hard work, and not simply through an accident of birth. So yes, I say as a Conservative that the Lords is an anachronism long overdue for reform, and the hereditaries are an insult to a 21st century democracy. And I say to any ministers who are listening that now is the time for a reformed and representative House of Lords with members who are there by merit and not by birth. And now is the time for us as Conservatives to remember that we are at our best when we seize the opportunity to reform instead of waiting for others to do it. We'll be waiting a long time for their lordships to grasp it. Let us do it now, rather than face the wrath of our electors.
Mr David Drew.
Thank you, Mr Walker, and delight to serve under your chairmanship. And I'm pleased to say I agree almost entirely with the honourable gentleman, but I come at it from a completely different perspective. So we may come to the same conclusion for the honourable member from Monmouth, but I would say there are different reasons why we should now seek the abolition of the House of Lords. I don't know if he was here when I was here in 2003. He avoided that when we did have the vote on what we felt should be the future of the House of Lords. And the then white paper came forward with 7 options, of which the House of Commons voted all 7 down. So we haven't got a terribly good track record of how we address this. We looked again in 2007, where I think the honourable gentleman was with us, and we did make some progress then. And surprisingly, we did come to an agreement within the Commons that we wanted an elected chamber, that it should be bicameral, and that we would abolish the hereditaries. Sadly, the government then fell in 2010, and I have to say for the last 8 years we don't seem to have made much further progress. Now, I think it's about time we revisited this issue, because it's pretty obvious this petition strikes a chord. I mean, people don't sign in their numbers, 169,000, and still mounting as we talk, People don't sign these petitions unless they feel quite strongly about the issue. Now, this may have been brought on by Brexit and people's antagonism with the way in which the Lords is performed, but it is much deeper. Now, as someone who speaks has got an awful lot of friends in the Lords, I may have a few less after this, I just think that it is time that we looked at what we want, not just the Lords to do, but of course this chamber itself. So why have I come round in favour of abolition? I think I voted in favour of an elected chamber last time round, but I now believe that we have to abolish, because quite simply I don't believe we'll ever do this unless we abolish. We have to put then something in its place, but we have to start on the basis of, if you like, the nihilistic approach of getting rid of what there already is to then put something else in its place. If we carry on the way we've been going, and we've got the latest attempt in terms of the Lord Speaker's commission, which I have to say is the very reason why we can't let the Lords reform themselves, because it's a very minimalistic and unacceptable. I'm sure it will never get through the Commons, so I don't even know why it has been brought forward. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
On that point, I agree with him that we need to abolish the Lords and start again. We do need a bicameral parliament. We have seen this. But the fact that we are starting with the Lord Speakers Committee, which does have broad agreement in the Lords, should be seen as a starting point. Because if we have a very radical proposition, the Lords themselves will vote down, we won't get any further. I don't think that the perfect should be the enemy of the good, as Voltaire said, and we need to have a proposal that can get through both houses.
Well, that may be true, but again, I am an idealist, and I believe that you ought to seek out what you see as the best solution, because otherwise you're always going to be ending up compromising. Now, there may well be that there are compromises that have to be allowed along the way. But why am I saying, and I want to actually concentrate on the Commons for a moment. I think one of the problems with the Commons at the moment is, and I've always argued this, we pass too much legislation, we pass too much bad legislation, and we rely on the Lords to try and get it right by scrutiny and revision. Well, it would help if we got it right in the first place, then we wouldn't necessarily need a chamber doing that. Now, again, that may be idealistic, but what I feel very strongly about is that the Commons has got to do its job better than it does at the moment. And there are all sorts of reasons why we cannot do that job satisfactorily. We're all too busy, we're all too multitasking, we've got this second chamber now, which is great because those of us who argued for it thought it was a way in which we could open up debate for backbenchers, but now we get criticised all the time that we're never in the main chamber, which is what the public says, and no one ever listens to the debates. So we have to try and cox and box these situations and realise that there isn't a perfect solution, but there are ones that we can help along the way. Now, one of the reasons I would get rid of the Lords at the moment is we have a fundamental problem with this building. And we have to vacate this building sometime soon. And I just think it's the time to look at what sort of structure we want, because it's daft coming back into whatever form this new building will take place, because it will be new, because it's effectively being rebuilt from the bottom up. It would be sensible if we had this debate now, so we establish what, if we want a second chamber, it should look like. The one thing I disagree with the petitioners over is that this should be then handled in the form of a referendum. Anyone who read what I said last week, I am very clear. I do not agree with referendums on anything at the moment, having what's happened with Brexit. I just think that it's about time Parliament reasserted its authority and decided what it wanted to do, and then we take the consequences because the electorate either vote for us or they don't. So, as I've said to my honourable friend, I'm not happy with what the Lord Speaker's Commission has come forward with. It just seems like a little bit of a temporary aberration from what I think is necessary, which is a radical overhaul of the way in which our chambers operate. Now, the obvious thing is, if I don't want a second chamber as it is, how would I see that second chamber operating, and how would I see it being arrived at? I see its role to be one of scrutiny and an overview of the legislation. And I think that is something that they do very well at the moment, but I do not want it as a second chamber which effectively replicates the Commons. The number of times I was told when we were in government, don't worry, the Commons won't agree to this, but we can get it through in the Lords, which always made me look pretty stupid as an MP, because I'd be arguing the case in the Commons and lose, only for it to be then turned over in the Lords where common sense prevailed. Now, that may seem a jolly good reason why we have the Lords. I just think, again, it's a negation of what should happen in the Commons, which is that we take authority, we debate things, and we deliberate, and we then pass through the legislation which we would make a better job of. In terms of that second chamber, I wouldn't now be in favour of electing it. I would make it a selectorate. I would keep it to about 200 people. I would allow those people to be representative of different ethnic groups, of different regions, of different interests. And how would that be arrived at? Well, I think that is a job for the select committees to interview appropriate people. Can you remember we had the People's Peers? Well, that lasted a long time, didn't it? I think we created about 6. And then it died a death. Now, it was a daft idea because it was one of New Labour's let's share it with the people type compromises. But in a sense, I think it's about time this chamber decided on the appropriate people. Now, again, I would make the period of office time limited. I would have it rotating so you'd always have some expertise, but people moving through. But they should apply, as they do in other walks of life, for particular roles. And to me, the obvious people to interview, and again, it's to put an onus upon parliamentarians here in the Commons, would be the select committees. Now, I'm basically saying we take the politics out of that chamber. It may be idealistic again, but I want expertise in that chamber. I want people who are going to sit down and know about science and arts and know about some of the finer details of legislation, including the law and religion and so on and so forth. But they're not going to ever challenge this chamber, because that's the problem at the moment. Effectively, we've got 2 chambers challenging one another. And we see that in terms of the attrition over Brexit, but it's happened time after time, because traditionally the Lords is there to champion the opposition to the government, because in a sense the government, in normal circumstances, not at the moment with a hung parliament, but in normal circumstances it will believe it can get its legislation through. Again, I just think that is something that puts the onus upon the Commons to get it right, and if the government get it wrong, then they pay the consequences of that. So just in conclusion then, I just feel that now is the time for this debate to be held. That's why I welcome the petition. I don't want a referendum. I want it to be decided by Parliament, and that may be where the Lords come into their blocking role. But, that's for them to decide. It will just take away their credibility completely if they're seen to stand in the way of what I think is the proper way in which we should evolve a bicameral arrangement, but where one element of that Parliament is democratically accountable, and the other is about expertise and about helping the process of the elected people. The final point I would make is whatever money we could save from the House of Lords, I'd give to us as MPs, not in terms of pay, but in terms of the way we run our offices. The one thing we cannot cope with, and we all would share this, is we're overwhelmed with constituency work. Now, that gives us our grounding. That's why we're different, because we know what's going on in each of our constituencies, because our constituencies tell us. The problem is, to do a decent job in terms of that role, you need additional resources, and we're always capped in terms of that. So I'd save the money from the Lords, I'd put it into running our offices, and allow us to have more time to do our job in the Commons, as we should be.
Mr. Howe.
And it's a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Let me start in a way that might portray me as a lawyer who is only interested in the detail of things. I'm very sorry for taking that position, but it's to pick up on something that the honourable gentleman who's just spoken said, and that this issue, as described in the petition, falls into 2 parts. There is a bit about the House of Lords, which my honourable friend has spoken of in a quite detailed way, and I will come back to that at the end. But the second part of it is that it calls for a referendum on the subject. And I'm surprised that this debate is taking place without a reference to the Council of Europe. The Council of Europe is a non-EU body. It's not part of the European Union. It is something completely separate, set up in 1949, with a whole number of organisations at different bits of it that work for it. And one of the organisations that it looks after is called the Venice Commission. And the Venice Commission that's a shorthand for the European Commission for Democracy Through Law. So it's another body full of lawyers, I suspect, but it does come up with some interesting material. And one of the things that it has come up with, and it came up with this first in 2005, it comes up with an analysis of how referenda should be conducted. And this is being continued at the moment by our Right Honourable friend, the member for Amersham and Chesham, who is in the process of producing a booklet for the Venice Commission that sets out how referenda should be conducted. And one of the problems that she has right at the beginning of this, if I may say so, is to how the referendum on our membership of the European Union fits into that, because I think she has a bit of difficulty with it. And one of the things that the Venice Commission likes to look at in looking at any referendum is there a national tradition for a referendum? And if you look just across the water to Ireland at the recent referendum on abortion, you will have seen that there is a formal need for a referendum in that country in order to change its constitution. We don't have that requirement in British law to need a referendum to change our constitution. And I think that we need to hang on to that as the starting point for where we are going with this. The approach that was taken by the former Prime Minister in saying that any constitutional issues should be subject to referendum is a haphazard and chaotic one. And it was not thought through in its entirety or with the level of detail that I would have expected from it. Now, we are where we are with that, and I'm not suggesting that we go back and rerun the EU referendum, anything but to go back and rerun that referendum. But nevertheless, we cannot go on simply piling on top of constitutional referenda, other constitutional referenda, until we have got our own house sorted out and in order. Now, this petition was inevitably influenced by the House of Lords and its reaction to Brexit, and that has already been commented on by a number of different speakers as to how they have overreached themselves in calling for certain amendments to be put forward. I think that conflicts with the guidance that the Venice Commission produced in how a referendum should be conducted and the aftermath of that referendum. And I think that we need to bear that in mind as we go forward so that we don't make the same mistake again. And for the reasons that were more succinctly stated by the honourable gentleman who just spoke, I don't like referendums either, and I wouldn't recommend one for this sort of activity. This is something that we need to take up ourselves and do. I think, though, that the Lord Speaker's committee is a starting point for that. It is clearly not the finishing point for it, and additional work needs to be undertaken on it, and additional time pressure needs to be put on them to come up with something that will actually reform the House of Lords. The difficulty we have with that is that, for reasons that everyone will know, it is not a priority for this government to undertake a large constitutional reform of the House of Lords at this stage. And I think we simply have to live with that at the moment. So just to repeat, it is always a good idea, since we are members of the Council of Europe, since we have been members of the Council of Europe since 1949, why don't we ever use the material that has been produced by the Council of Europe, that has been produced with members of this House all the way through in part of our deliberations? It's as if we just cut ourselves off completely from it and just pretend it doesn't exist. I think that the arguments that have been put forward that say we should do this ourselves are very valid, and I am very pleased to recommend those to the Minister.
Thank you. Simon Hart.
Thank you very much. So I came here with no intention of actually making a speech, but I was reminded by the Honourable Member for Stroud of those days back in 2011-2012 when this was debated in the main chamber in government time, when the coalition government was in office, and how frustrating it was that there were numerous reforms with which we all agreed and which would have proceeded had it not been for the fact that our partners in the coalition at the time were so wedded to the concept of an elected second chamber that nothing else mattered. And the entire reform programme fell pretty well as a result of that intransigence. And so the Honourable Gentleman's speech reminded me of that. I was amused, as I always am, by my honourable friend from Monmouth's contribution, which I agreed with some and disagreed with other elements of it. But I took it, and I hope I'm not misquoting him here, as being a pre-guarantee that should, when his illustrious and long political career in the Commons comes to an end, if he should be offered a place in the House of Lords, I took this as a pre-refusal of that particular honour. So he can always intervene. He can always intervene and tell me that I'm wrong. But anyway, it's one less to worry about if that is the case. Mr. Walker, to me, this is all about, as I mentioned in an intervention, about primacy of the House of Commons. And the reason that the measures fell all those years ago was because we couldn't find a way around the fact that if we didn't want the Commons to be compromised, if we wanted the Commons to be a proper representation of public opinion and public feeling, then it has to have primacy. And that any other chamber, this is an argument about not against reform, but against having elected elements of it, particularly some of the crazy schemes about sort of two 7-year terms or whatever some of the proposals were. But the moment that there was any suggestion of an elected element of the upper house, then it was the Commons which was going to suffer as a consequence. And so what we couldn't get around, it seemed, was the idea that this was parliamentary reform. It was not abolition of the House of Lords. It wasn't reform of the House of Lords. It was wholesale constitutional reform of Parliament and the Commons in particular. And it struck me then, and it strikes me now, that if we were in a situation where, as a result of the mood of the electorate, we had a substantial government majority in the Commons which was matched in the House of Lords, then we have a situation where checks and balances would be significantly reduced, and the ability of the Lords to sometimes aggressively review and improve and scrutinise legislation, that would be somewhat reduced. So, to my mind, I don't think we should be too sort of pompous about some of the rejection, some of the arguments we're getting from the House of Lords at the moment. It is important that the government's position on Brexit is challenged, however uncomfortable that might be. And I think it's a little early to write off the House of Lords as, in my view, as an anachronism worthy of abolition before this process has ended. At the moment, it has, as it often does. Yes, of course. Yeah.
Thank you very much. He's basically making a point that there would be a problem with which house would be the most legitimate at any given point if both were elected. Could I ask him then to speculate on why it is that so many countries across the world manage to have a bicameral structure with two elected houses, and that problem doesn't seem to arise? And if he does think it's fundamental to the structure of Parliament, would he then consider, to begin with, that we should exhaust the possibilities of a unicameral legislator before deciding whether and what type of revising chamber we might wish?
Honourable Gentleman is absolutely right. This is not dismissing other potential reforms. It is simply making observations about why, when we had the opportunity, when there was momentum, when there was some spirit behind the proposals back in 2011, 2012, why they failed. And they failed because it spooked members of the House of Commons who thought that their primacy was in danger of being compromised. And unsurprisingly, it spooked members of the House of Lords who felt that they were going to have to face the vulgarity of an election from time to time. And so we have to be pragmatic. And my point is about pragmatism. If we want this to proceed, it's no good quoting what may be the case in other countries, however bona fide those examples may be. We have to get it through here. We have to get the proposals through both Houses of Parliament here. And I'm just interested in exploring ways in which we can legitimately do that and make progress. The other point I'd make in response to his intervention is this. If we can dip our toe in the reforming water and find that actually it is okay, other reforms will follow. I think part of this is a fear of anything which is different. If we can make this an evolutionary process rather a revolutionary process, I suspect a lot of the reforms that we're talking about, which have so far apparently been impossible to achieve, will become a little bit easier. So I'm not attempting to, in a sense, dismiss his comments. I think they're legitimate, but we have to look at them in the context and the history of numerous attempts over the last 10 or 20 years to address this problem, all of which have been unsuccessful. So I think most of which have been unsuccessful so far. And I just wanted to, as I was attempting to explain, I think as far as the Brexit situation is concerned, which is what has really stimulated interest in this, I have no particular fear from the Lords making some uncomfortable observations about the direction in which the government is going. But I would take a very different view were it to become absolutely obvious that the intention of the Lords was to frustrate the will of the elected chamber. Those two things, I believe, are different, and we're not there yet. We might be there in a matter of days, but we're not there yet, and therefore we're unable to pass, or should be cautious about passing sentence, I think, today. But as far as other measures, and the Honourable Gentleman from Stroud hinted at reforms which could make progress. Things like reduction in numbers, I'm entirely sympathetic to, not so much in the Commons, by the way, in case the Minister's listening, but in the House of Lords, I can completely understand that. I think the expertise comment is, I agree with pretty well every contribution that's made, although I suspect if we went down a different route, rather than save money, it might cost money, because these might have to be salaried positions if we are to have an appointments panel which simply selects people or advertises vacancies and selects people. If we are to avoid, or if we're to create a second chamber which is properly diverse and properly representative, then it could be that comes at a salaried price. And thirdly, there is possibly opportunities to look again at the 1949 Parliament Act, which, as the proposer of this motion pointed out, has its drawbacks because it was created in a time when none of these circumstances were anticipated. But perhaps revisiting that with a view to ensuring that the Commons can get its way, perhaps a rather more timely fashion, might be one way in which we can start some sensible progress. So, Mr Walker, thank you for allowing me that. I think that as I say, reform, we need to take a pragmatic approach to reform, because otherwise we will find ourselves, as we have so frustratingly often in the past, in a position where no progress can ever be made because somebody somewhere is going to lose out. And if we continue to make proposals which are not politically digestible, then we will be having this debate again in a few years' time.
Mr. David Linden.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Mr Walker, and as ever, what a pleasure it is to serve under your chairmanship, and I look forward to doing so again on Wednesday of next week. I want to commend the Honourable Gentleman, the member for Sutton and Cheam, on opening the debate, and also to thank the 116 constituents of the Centre of the Universe that is Glasgow East for signing this petition. I left huge amounts of space in my notes for summing up contributions, and I've got to say, I normally come along to petitions debates, and this place is normally stuffed. Sometimes you can't get a seat in here. And I must say I'm quite struck by how empty Westminster Hall is this afternoon. I'm sure it's nothing to do with the fact that quite a lot of MPs are very conscious of the fact when they leave this place they can go and park their backsides on the red leather. So perhaps it's an issue of self-interest. I don't know, I'm only speculating, Mr Walker. But I did think it was rather ironic that I was saying to the staff in my constituency office that on Friday this week, my week will be concluded. My week will be concluded by visiting a care home in my constituency, and I thought it was rather remarkable that I could stand up and talk about another care home this afternoon. That is the House of Lords. Anybody who watched the programme Meet the Lords will hear people talk about it's the most exclusive daycare unit in central London. And I'm reminded about Lord Palmer, who took part in that documentary, the noble Lord Palmer, who, to say is a bit of a character, would be putting it mildly. This is a gentleman who has a 110-room mansion and was complaining about the little pay that he gets at just £300 a day, of course, tax-free. And I've got to say, Mr Walker, I didn't know anything of this Lord Palmer chap, so I thought, well, I shall go and look him up. So I thought it would be helpful for the House, because we don't get the opportunity to talk about these folk very often. So Adrian Palmer is the 4th Baron Palmer. Adrian Bailey Nottage Palmer, 4th Baron Palmer, an aristocrat and landowner in Scotland. Lord Palmer succeeded his uncle in the peerage in 1990 and is now one of 90 hereditary peers elected to remain in the House of Lords after the passing of the House of Lords Act 1999. He sits as a crossbencher. I'm sure he's a perfectly affable chap, and certainly seems like quite an eclectic or eccentric individual when you watch the programme Meet the Lords. But it does come to this point where this is someone who has never been subjected to election before, but sits in that place as a member of as a hereditary peer. It will come as no surprise that me speaking as a nationalist politician, I'm quite happy to outline our position in the House of Lords. We think it should be abolished. We have nothing to do with it. I can say that on this, we are whiter than white. In our 50 years of continued parliamentary representation in this place, we have never taken up a peerage despite being offered them. We've never done it. We're not here to play the Westminster game, and I'm very glad to say that that is the case. I'm disappointed that other parties do take part in it, but what an absolute shambles, Mr Walker. You know, it's the only larger legislature in the whole of the world is the Chinese National People's Congress, with a total number of 2,987 seats. Of course, the other place, our comrades in Ermin along the corridor, they've got 800. And when you consider and you compare those numbers, and when China, a population of 1.4 billion, and they have 2,987 members of the National Congress, and we, a country of just 66 million, have 800 of them stuffed into that absolute circus along there, it really does make an absolute mockery of the whole system. I've spoken before, not least in committee as well, where the Honourable Lady from Norwich, who serves as the Minister, I've spoken about my time doing work with the Westminster Foundation for Democracy. I've got to say, Mr Walker, I do find it somewhat embarrassing when I go and do work with Westminster Foundation for Democracy, because to appear on behalf of an organisation called the Westminster Foundation for Democracy implies that this is a place of democracy, when in fact the Westminster Parliament, the Palace of Westminster, is a place of limited democracy. We see, not long, I think only a couple of weeks ago, Chief Whips on both the Labour side and the Government side were having to issue notices to members of the other place, urging them not to fall asleep. Now, I don't say what kind of message that sends out. When I go to Tunisia or to Uganda to talk about the merits of democracy from Westminster, what an absolute embarrassment that this is the kind of thing that happens here. And I was reminded by the wonderful book from the late Robin Cook, and I very much commend it to the House, the Point of Departure, but there's a fantastic quote I read a number of years ago. And Robin Cook, of course, wrestled with House of Lords reform, but he said in his book, "At least we are all agreed that the present half-reformed state of the Lords was unsupportable. Britain now shares with Lesotho the unenviable distinction of being the only two countries in which hereditary chieftains still retain the right to pass laws for the rest of the nation. As Foreign Secretary, I had spoken in support of open government at a Europe-Africa summit. I was rebuked by the President of an African country which might generously be described as a guided democracy, who objected that he could not be blamed for failing to introduce full democracy after only 50 years of independence, when Britain had failed to get rid of the hereditary principle after 500 years of Parliament." And it was remarkable. This guy's now dead, and we still have these hereditary peers sitting over in the House of Lords. It makes an absolute mockery of it. And the thing that makes a further mockery of it is the fact that we have clerics still legislating the 26 bishops, temporal and spiritual. There is only one other country in the world that has clerics that legislate, and that is Iran. Just think about it. Just let that sink in. The only other legislature in the world that allows clerics to legislate is Iran, and we're part of that as well. It really does make an absolute mockery. And of course, myself, my honourable friend from the City of Chester, and indeed the Minister, have a long-standing engagement on a Wednesday morning to consider, we don't really consider a motion to adjourn in respect of the Parliamentary Constituencies Amendment Bill. And that bill from my honourable friend, the member for Manchester Central, seeks to protect this House from the government's plans to cut the number of MPs from 650 down to 600. So the government talks a good game about cutting the cost of politics, yet they continue to stuff people into the House of Lords. We have lords like, I hesitate to use the word noble, Lord Hanningfield, who was caught this routine of clocking in and clocking out, wandering into the Palace of Westminster for a couple of minutes, signing on, then getting his £300 a day tax-free. And I would very much commend my honourable friend, the member for Edinburgh Eastern, who's come up with an excellent idea, I think, of somehow changing the rules in here that would be able to track how long members of the House of Peers are actually in the building, because it certainly seems that some of them walk in and walk back out only a couple of minutes later, and at the moment we've got no way of tracking that, and I think that makes a real mockery of the current system. But I've got to say, I pride myself in the fact that I start every parliamentary week by going out in my constituency and door knocking, and I did the exact same before I caught that 12:30 flight to London this afternoon. I was out in the Calvi area of my constituency, which is an area where there is certain amounts of deprivation. And I've got to say, my constituents in Calvi look at that place, the House of Lords, and wonder, how do these folk represent them? And I've got to say, you look at the information that's been brought forward by the Electoral Reform Society that shows that something like 85% of peers are all kind of coalesce around this little southeastern part of England. So we don't have members of the House of Lords that represent all parts of the United Kingdom and can bring their expertise. It really does seem to be the case that it is people from this small corner. And I've got to say, where are the lords who are our tenement lords? Where are the apprentice lords? Where are the lords who are from a manual labour background? Because it seems to me, and I say this with respect to the honourable gentleman from Henley, it seems to me that it's all people who are from the professions of lawyers or accountants. And then we come to the issue of corruption, the donors, the cash for votes, whether it's the DUP in the House of Commons being bought off with £1 billion to go and vote with the government, or in the fact that in the past we've seen people who have been offered peerages for donations to political parties. I think that really does bring the place into disrepute as well. And then we come to the issue of rewards for failure. And I think of the case of the constituency of Perth and North Perthshire. My honourable friend, member for Perth and North Perthshire, won his seat by, I think, 26 votes, defeating the Conservative candidate at the time, a gentleman called Ian Duncan, who was a member of the European Parliament. And so, quite rightly, my honourable friend from Perth and North Perthshire took up his seat in the House of Commons and does a very diligent job as chair of the Scottish Affairs Select Committee and indeed our shadow leader of the House of Commons. But his opponent, now Lord Duncan of Springbank, sits in the other place, having received no votes, indeed rejected at the ballot box just over a year ago, but was stuffed into the House of Lords. He wasn't just stuffed in there as someone to scrutinise legislation, but he was stuffed in there as somebody who is now a government minister. And we have the absolutely bizarre spectacle, Mr Walker. We have all these fine new Scottish Tory MPs who come here, and none of them were considered worthy enough to become the junior Scotland Office Minister. Instead, it was left to Lord Duncan of Springbank, unelected, to fly the flag for the Scotland Office as a junior minister. But I want to talk about one thing in particular, and it's about the duty of care that we owe to some of our colleagues in the House of Lords. I know that it's not the convention in this House to talk out of school and that it's a bit of an old boys' club, but I make no apology for saying that on Tuesday the 27th of March, myself and a number of my honourable friends were going out for a run after parliamentary business had concluded. And the Lords was sitting late that night because they were considering the Nuclear Safeguards Bill. And so as myself and 2 or 3 of my honourable friends were getting our running gear on, we found an elderly gentleman lost in the members' lobby in the House of Commons, where our cloakroom is. Absolutely confused as to where he was, didn't know what day of the week it was. And one thing that we noticed was the little red and white pass. And he didn't realise that he was in the completely wrong side of the building, didn't know what day of the week it was, let alone what clause or schedule of the Nuclear Safeguards Bill was being considered. And I understand that governments of various colours, on a day when it's a tight vote, will try and get their people in here. But there is something incredibly serious about bringing somebody in here who has not the mental faculties that they require, not only to know what day of the week it is, but indeed what kind of legislation it is they're scrutinising. And that is the kind of thing that does happen in here. And I know it's uncomfortable for everybody in here to talk about it because we all know that it happens. People being wheeled in here who don't know what day of the week it is, but are somehow scrutinising legislation. And the final thing that I would say, and it's with a degree of regret because I do hold my honourable friend from the member of the City of Chester and indeed Labour colleagues in high esteem. But I think there's a challenge to the Labour Party for this as well. The Labour Party in the past have talking under the regime of the Right Honourable Gentleman from Islington North, that they would take a principled approach to the House of Lords. But we now have these Ermine Conways, the Lord Momentums. Only recently, in the last rounds of appointments to the House of Lords, we have the former General Secretary of the British Labour Party, who is now being appointed to the House of Lords, Martha Ossamore, and another, I think, Pauline Coleman, I think was the name. So there is a challenge here that if we are all serious about halting the absolute shambles that is the House of Lords, then we've all got to be signed up to that. Very happy to give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Thank the honourable member for giving way. Is he aware that one of the conditions of those appointments was that they would agree to vote for an abolition of the House of Lords if such a vote arose?
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for his remarks on that. I think the Liberal Democrats had quite a similar position as well. I'm afraid that when it comes to the appointment of the House of Lords, it's like the political drugs, that once you start doing it, you just keep going. And the idea that somehow political parties will self-regulating on this really does, it's not something that I take very seriously. But Mr Walker, the House of Lords does make an absolute mockery of British democracy, and we can come here and we can have a discussion about reform, we can have a discussion about abolition, certainly the latter of which is my preferred option. But I've got to say, the sooner that Scotland is completely has nothing to do with the House of Lords and the Palace of Westminster, the better, in my view.
Thank you, Mr Walker. What a great pleasure it is to see you in the chair and to serve under your chairmanship. And can I start by congratulating the honourable gentleman from Sutton and Cheam, who I thought did great credit both to the petition and to the Petitions Committee in leading this debate. And he managed to present the arguments, but as well as giving some of his own personal view, which he's entitled to, in a very fair and balanced way. He talked about the advantages of Lords reform and the advantage of the Lords that has external expertise and experience. And he also talked about the phrase that particularly struck me: the Lords do more of the things that the Commons do less of, and that there is a complementary function there. And he outlined different options for reform, which I found very interesting. There can be an academic debate here as well as a political debate about how we actually proceed. Do we have, as he said, an elected, an appointed, or indeed a hybrid chamber? And the honourable gentleman suggested that one of the blocks to reform is a lack of consensus on what to replace it with. And I would suggest, Mr Walker, that actually we've seen that here in the debate today, that there is no real consensus as to how we proceed. And that is one of the reasons why we're not proceeding at all. But there is a real danger, is there not, that the legitimacy of the Lords will continue to decline. And my concern is that if the legitimacy of the Lords continues to decline, that drags down the whole of Parliament and therefore ourselves in this place as well. I was particularly interested in the responses that he gave from students at Strathclyde University, and was it Stelling Grammar School? Stenning Grammar School. A lack of diversity in the Lords, a view that it was simply a job for life but for politicians. And again, there is a danger based on the position that he was outlining, that the nation is changing faster than we in Parliament are changing, and we're not keeping up with changing attitudes in the nation. And further evidence that the Lords is coming further and further out of touch with the attitudes of the younger generation, which are not reflected. My honourable friend from Ellesmere Port and Neston talked of a closed political world from a different century, and I think there is a very real danger that that's the case. My honourable friend from Ellesmere Port and Neston also quoted Blackadder in the Dunny-on-the-Wold by-election, which brought a smile to her face, but again, there is a danger that life imitates art and that the relevance and credibility of the whole of Parliament, not just their Lordship's House, is damaged. 1 in 5 members of the Lords do not vote, we're told. and my honourable friend from Ellesmere Port and Neston, who's also, of course, my constituency next-door neighbour, talked about not assuming that simply because we're appointed, that gives expertise, and he's absolutely right in that. The honourable gentleman from Monmouth gave us an excellent and intriguing history lesson, particularly on the changing nature of the Conservative Party over the years. Sadly, he didn't bring us bang up to date with where he feels that the Conservative Party is at the moment, but he made a great point about seizing the moment and shaping the change that you want to see. He didn't actually, forgive me if I'm doing him a disservice, he didn't actually talk about the actual type of change that he would like, but in typical fashion from the honourable gentleman, he was very forthright in his views. And my good friend, the member for Stroud, gave a very considered speech about what we actually want the Lord's Chamber to do, and a considered view of where we might currently be going astray in this House, which again throws an additional element into the debate. The gentleman from Henley started off by warning the dangers of sounding like a lawyer. My honourable friend from Ellesmere Port and Neston, his ears pricked up then because, of course, he is a lawyer. But I can say to the gentleman from Henley, he didn't. Again, a different aspect of and a different approach to the debate about the question of how we organise constitutional change and how we manage referendums, which I thought added a different element to the debate. And my good friend from Carmarthen, who said he was amused by his honourable friend from Monmouth, talked about the importance of the primacy of the Commons. And again, this is another additional complication, but is a relevant consideration, Mrs. Moon, when we're talking about reform. And again, it's probably one of those reasons why reform has not happened so far, because we cannot decide on how this would affect our own House, let alone how it would affect the other House. And he talked about, and I wanted to come on to the question of Brexit in a moment, but he talked about the fact that we have to wait and see how the Lords behave over the ping-pong process this week, and whether they will accept the decisions of this House. But what is clear is that there is a crisis of legitimacy with the House of Lords and with the way it is composed. And even if perhaps we don't feel it as acutely here, there are members of the public, 169,000 and counting of them, for whom the House of Lords no longer represents a legitimate part of the legislature. The question is how we go forward. I do want to, however, Mrs. Moon, express some concern at the nature of this debate. It is timely, and it has come about, I believe, because there are an awful lot of people out there who believe, potentially incorrectly, goes back to the point from the gentleman from Carmarthen, we shall see in due course, that their Lordship's House intend to somehow block Brexit, or at least the quickest and hardest possible Brexit possible. But even today, in its current composition, the Lords has a constitutional role as a revising chamber, and as a chamber offering a pause to consider bad legislation. And I do find it ironic that some honourable members, none here, I hasten to add, Mrs. Moon, are happy to block private members' bills in this place, private members' bills such as free hospital car parking charges for carers or the long-term sick, or, dare I say it, an urgently needed law to ban the revolting practice of upskirting, and use the lame excuse of blocking that legislation, that they don't like legislation that has not been debated and thought through, and they use the mechanism of stopping any debate at all. And yet when the House of Lords thoroughly debates a matter dear to these honourable members' hearts, and asks us to pause and give time for more consideration, all of a sudden they're up in arms at too much debate and call for the abolition of the Lords. You can't have it both ways. Debate is good. Reflection on legislation is good, but when it comes to debate on Brexit, all of a sudden it is blocking the so-called will of the people, which I would remind the House is not necessarily the will of the people, but a will of the slim majority of voters. And I am concerned that rather than a detailed discussion about the type of democracy that we want in this House and the type of legislature that we want, that the petition and many of the signatories of the petition, although of course I can't, Mrs Moon, presume to know why all of them would have chosen to sign it, but that for many of them this is simply a frustration over Brexit. And attacking the Lords is part of a broader strategy that we've seen in some of our newspapers of attacking and undermining any institution that they believe might be getting in their way. Before the calling the snap 2017 general election, the Prime Minister attacked the other place, describing peers as opponents of the government who had vowed to fight us every step of the way. We've seen honourable members in this House attack the integrity and impartiality of the civil service. We've seen the senior judiciary attacked. And honourable members in this place, Conservative honourable members, have been attacked as traitors in certain newspapers for standing up and voting according to their convictions. And if I may move slightly from the subject of the debate, if we really wanted to make ours a fairer and more open and democratic political discourse, we might start with the unelected, unaccountable, uncontrolled power of those national newspapers and their billionaire owners, whose opinions taint our politics so much long before we dealt with the House of Lords. But that's another debate for another day, Mrs Moon. It's notable that, and I welcome the honourable members from the benches opposite in their conversion to looking at the need to address the House of Lords and the undemocratic nature that it clearly poses. Because for hundreds of years the Conservatives had an inbuilt majority in the Lords. The honourable gentleman from Monmouth talked about the changing nature of the composition. But I have to say I don't recall hearing any complaints during that time from the Conservative side. But with the abolition of most of the hereditary peers, with an anachronism I have to say that I still find very hard to explain to foreign visitors, that inbuilt majority ceased to exist. My noble friend Baroness Smith reminded the other place recently that challenge and scrutiny are not new. They were not invented by this, i.e. the current Labour opposition. The then Conservative opposition, during the time when my side were in government, I quote, could boast well over 500 government defeats, including 145 during the 2005 to 2010 Labour government, and 245 during the 2001 to 2005 Labour government, which had an elected majority of 167 in this House. Those many defeats inflicted in the Lords included a government bill at second reading, 2 fatal statutory instruments, and a number of key national security measures that involved ping-pong late into the night. So it is only since 2010, I feel, that the Conservatives have shown any concern for the composition of the Lords, but their response has been to pack it with more live peers than any preceding government. David Cameron appointed more peers per year and at a faster rate than any other Prime Minister since 1958, when life peerages were first introduced, and more were from the government parties and fewer from the opposition. Indeed, on the weekend of the royal wedding, the Prime Minister sneaked out her appointment of 9 Tory peers, following the legacy of the predecessor as Prime Minister, David Cameron, with only 3 from this side. And all of this at the same time, and I think the honourable gentleman from Glasgow mentioned this, the government intends to press ahead with its plans to cut the number of elected MPs by 50. It seems incongruous to me that we are considering Lords reform, we're not considering Lords reform, but we are considering cutting the size of the elected chamber. So let me be clear, Labour believes that the second chamber should be democratically elected. However, the first steps must be to reduce the number of peers, and a good way to start would be to remove the remaining hereditary peers, particularly along the lines suggested in its private members' bill by my right honourable friend, the member for Delyn, a private members' bill that remains on the order paper today. Indeed, my right honourable friend from Delyn reminds me that all but one of the hereditary peers currently sitting in the House of Lords are male. There's only one female hereditary there. And we talk about diversity. That's a basic starting point. There can surely be no continued justification for hereditary members of our legislature. We in this side have proposed a constitutional convention to decide the best way forward for a second chamber. We support the Burns proposals as a start, which seem entirely sensible. Above all, we want a solution that is workable, democratic and fair, that is genuinely thought through, rather than what I fear is a current knee-jerk reaction to the Lords doing its constitutional role of offering our own House a chance to think again, particularly on the Brexit issue that is before us at the moment. If we care about good legislation, we should be grateful for the chance to think again and not get intimidated by national newspaper owners. But we have to ask the question, is an appointed chamber, let's not even mention a semi-hereditary chamber, so suitable to be part of a democratic parliament in the 21st century? This subject isn't going to go away, and I commend the idea to this House of a constitutional convention so that we can get over those blocks, those disagreements that are actually blocking the way forward, so that we can finally decide how to reform the House of Lords. And I urge honourable members to get behind the idea, get on with the discussion so that we can get on with reform.
Minister. Thank you very much indeed, Mrs Moon, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship and earlier on that of Mr Walker. I would like to thank honourable members for their contributions to this important debate, spanning, of course, those members from Henley, from Ellesmere Port, from Stroud, from Monmouth, from Carmarthen, and of course the front benches. And I have continued to welcome listening to my honourable colleagues who together with me and some others, seem to trot this territory fairly regularly, and it gets better every single time. Now, I'm also grateful, of course, to those who signed the petition that brought us here, and I would particularly like to put that on record, Mrs Moon. It is important, I think, that when a debate has been triggered by an e-petition, and in this case one of large numbers, that I think it's important that we note that inside this debate, because after all, we are Democrats. We are here, in fact, today, particularly talking about a democratic matter, are we not? And it's important that we carefully consider and give due respect to the issues raised by those who have asked us to serve in this place. So I'd like to have that on the record as we begin. Let me also begin my remarks by stating very simply the government's position on this matter, which is that we do not think that a referendum on the position or the composition of the House of Lords is the right way forward at this time. It is not something that the government supports. Now, in part, that's because there are many other things which are a priority for this government at this time and for parliamentary time at this time. And I think all honourable members know that, in fact, when we consider the extent of the parliamentary schedule that we need to complete in order to simply secure a controlled and stable exit from the European Union, to say the least, and that doesn't even include other things that we wish to do on domestic subjects. It is clear that we do need to deal in priorities, and I want to be very honest about that early on in this debate. I think it's also important to note that the request in the petition for a referendum as the specific manner of achieving this reform is not something that the government is prepared to agree to at this time. We do note that referenda are, of course, costly and time-consuming. Lords reform, I think, as has been evidenced by the debate today, continues to be a subject where there isn't any consensus, and I welcome that point being made from the opposite front bench. And I think throughout this debate we have demonstrated, after all, in our debate this afternoon, as well as in many other places and in many other sources, that, to say the least, there isn't an obvious binary design question that you could put in a referendum. So we don't think this is a suitable matter for a referendum at this time. Now, turning instead to some other points that we have seen in this House, Mrs Moon, on this topic. I think you will recall the House of Lords Reform Bill of 2012, which did seek wide-scale reform, and it would have introduced a predominantly elected second chamber. Now, that bill was withdrawn when it became clear that its timetabling motions couldn't be agreed to in the other place, in the House of Lords itself, by members of that House. Now, that wasn't from a lack of commitment from the government of the day, but it was, I would say, from a lack of overall agreement as to what shape reform should take. So I think we are back to that point, that there isn't a single clear design proposal here. But I would like honourable members today to be in no doubt that the government will ensure that the Lords should continue to fulfil its vital constitutional role. Now, we think it has an important role in scrutinising and revising legislation, and we do think that it brings valuable experience and expertise to the matters that it considers, Mrs Moon. Where reforms to the House of Lords within that constitutional role could command consensus, we would be willing to work with peers to take those measures forward. And now that's something that we have already done. And so there is a track record here in which the government has worked with both houses to introduce some focused and important reforms. To start with government support, the House of Lords Reform Act in 2014 enabled peers to retire permanently for the first time, and, crucially, it provided for peers to be disqualified where they do not attend or are convicted of serious offences. We supported the House of Lords Expulsion and Suspension Act of 2015, which provided the Lords with the power to expel members in cases of serious misconduct. Now bringing that right up to date, we are pleased that 84 peers have taken advantage of the retirement provisions and that retirement is becoming part of the culture of the House of Lords. Yes, of course.
Very grateful to the Minister for giving way. To recall the point that I made in my speech about members of the House of Lords who perhaps don't still have all their faculties with them. So the Government has spoken about provisions that's been put in place to allow people to retire. What provisions are in place to make sure that the people who are in the House of Lords are actually still able to do their job?
Well, I think the Honourable Member will understand if I focus on the point that we're trying to bring about a culture of that retirement. Now, it is actually for a person, I think, to recognise for themselves, perhaps where they may not be any longer able to do that role. And I actually welcome the sensitive way in which he's brought that topic up in this debate. It is an important matter. But as I say, to have a culture of retirement is a very sound starting point to being able to look at any such issues. Now, going ahead from here, the government is clear that we want to work constructively with members and peers, so members of both houses, to look at pragmatic ideas for reducing the size of the House of Lords. And that's why we welcome the work of the Lord Speakers Committee, chaired by Lord Burns. I think, as honourable members here today will be aware, in 2016 the Lords passed a motion that its size should be reduced and that we ought to look at how to do that. So the Lord Speaker established a committee to identify practical and politically viable options for reducing the size of the House, which wouldn't require primary legislation. So this is about being able to get something done, which I hear honourable members calling for today, and I think quite wisely we should look at those things which can simply be done, or be done simply and in a way that commands consensus. Now, that committee went on to make recommendations for reducing the size of the House, and peers were clearly very supportive of those measures when they were debated in December last year. The Prime Minister has written to the Lord Speaker with an offer in good faith to continue with the restraint that she's already shown in making appointments to that House. And I would just place on record that even with the latest small number of appointments, which were only 13, the House is now smaller than when she first took office. And I do think it's important for that fact to be very clearly on the record. The Lord Speaker will consider his next steps by reconstituting that committee, and the government is very happy to look at anything further that they have to say. I will just bring my remarks to a conclusion here, Mrs Moon, before allowing the representative of the Petitions Committee to say a final word in today's debate. I would just return to the point that I do think it is clear from honourable members' contributions to today's debate, which I found very thoughtful and wide-ranging, as well as many other sources, whether that be articles, or whether that be public discourse, or whether, of course, that be those members of the public who've come here today to be part of this petition, and I want again to thank them for that. There remains a range of views, there remains a range of design options, there remains a range of advantages and disadvantages that could be considered in this question, but there isn't an obvious single way forward. So I would simply reiterate the point that I made earlier. The government is committed to ensuring that the House of Lords continues to fulfil its constitutional role as a revising and scrutinising chamber, but that it must respect the primacy of the elected chamber, which is the House of Commons. We stand ready to work with parliamentarians from both chambers on measures which command consensus.
Paul Scully to wind up.
Thank you, Mrs Moon. It's a pleasure to serve on your chairmanship for the second half of this debate. And it's been a very constructive debate, I think, with wide-ranging views. People have not held back, and they've really raised some very pertinent issues. Plenty of things for us to take away. So I'd like to thank all of the honourable members for their contribution today. The whole point about the Petitions Committee in the petition system is that we get to speak in this place on issues that the petitioners and people want us to talk about, rather than what we want to talk about. And so I hope that the petitioner and the other 169,000 people that have signed that petition have felt that their issues have been aired. But it is the start of a process. This is not a single event. We always say that, and when we talk about petitions, it's always the start of a campaign, not at the end of it. So I'd just like to thank Roy McBride for starting the petition, and I hope that we don't get away from the site that Mr McBride actually started this petition, not from the prism of the EU withdrawal bill, although, as I say, I'm sure many people signed it on that basis, but he started it because of his sense, of the pure angle of the democratic validity of the House of Lords. I hope that although I gave him a fair hearing, that I didn't come down on his side, that I think he did carry a majority of the House out of this chamber, of people actually wanting to abolish or seriously go further in reform. But it is clear that there was no clear agreement about how we should do it. So it is a complicated matter. And I think we really do need to, therefore, have plenty more discussion, however that discussion and debate, form of that discussion and debate takes, to get a clear path for everyone to agree to before we move to legislation. Looking back at the 2012 debate in the House of Lords reform that was ultimately unsuccessful, ultimately didn't result in any change. 14 out of 88 sitting days in the House of Commons was consumed by discussion of the House of Lords reforms, which that's before you even get to the time taken in the other place as well. Ultimately, for no change to occur. So we've got to make sure that we can get it right. So let's start with what we can achieve. I think the Burns Committee is going a long way towards doing that. I understand the sentiment of this place and the various sentiments from across the chamber, but at least hopefully that's the start of a direction of Lords reform that people can then feel they can relate to the other place and have this as a proper democratically functioning bicameral system. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered e-petition 209433 relating to a referendum on the abolition of the House of Lords. As many as of that opinion say aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it, the ayes have it. Order, order.